Can you clarify whether U.S. troops are operating inside the Central African Republic as has been reported? Are they helping to support efforts against the Lord's Resistance Army? What is their role?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, we do have U.S. troops in the Central African Republic acting as advisors, and their only mission is to combat the Lord's Resistance Army and to support the AU, primarily Ugandan mission, to counter the Lord's Resistance Army and encourage defections and, of course, find Joseph Kone.
You stated in your testimony, orally as well as on page 5 of your written testimony, that the U.S. has led discussions calling for President Jotoja to reverse his plan to integrate 3,500 former Seleka rebels into CAR security forces and another 1,500. What has been the outcome of those interventions? And could you, for the committee, elaborate on the composition of Seleka?
Mr. Chairman, allow me to begin with the latter part of your question. Okay. We believe that Seleka originally numbered around 4,000 people. It has grown over the months since the rebellion began to about 20,000. While we have no exact count, there's anecdotal evidence to suggest that perhaps 3/4 of that 20,000 originate in Chad or Sudan. As for the integration of those Seleka forces into the police and the Army, we have made it very clear that we cannot support President Jotoja's efforts to do that. The Bangui Declaration and efforts by our partners in the International Contact Group, we hope will lead him to rethink that entire approach. There is no question that the CAR needs an effective Army and an effective police force, but it needs to be representative of all the people and of all religious groups in the country.
With regards to MISCA, you point out that you believe that MISCA is the best mechanism for quickly addressing the ongoing violence in the CAR. MISCA is what, about 2,500 troops? How robust is their rules of engagement? One of my biggest takeaways from multiple trips to Africa and elsewhere, including the former Yugoslavia during the worst days of the bombings and the killings in Sarajevo, was a lack of a mandate to truly be peacemakers rather than to be garrisoned. I saw the same thing in the DR Congo on trips years ago, and my first trip to Darfur saw the same thing as well, a rule of engagement that was far less than robust. What's their rules of engagement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's worth noting that the UN mission is actually called a peace-building mission, precisely because we need rules of engagement that are very clear, that permit peace to be restored. This is not a peacekeeping mission, unfortunately. We hope eventually it will transition to a peacekeeping mission under AU's auspices. But the key is that right now, the 2,500 troops from the Economic Community of Central African States that are on the ground, plus another 1,500 we expect from those countries, as well as Burundi and potentially other AU members, will be able to restore peace. And they are currently engaged in fighting in cleanup operations, in any operation necessary to restore peace. So they have very robust rules of engagement, and we think appropriate rules of engagement for the situation.
Are there any funding or resource issues, lack of material, money to buy bullets for MISCA, for example, and weapons? Are there deficiencies there?
Mr. Chairman, we plan to request the Congress's approval to provide about $40 million for MISCA's operations.
When will that be?
Within the next few weeks. We're actively working on using several different pots of money in order to have sufficient funds for this worthy mission. The assistance that we would provide would be non-lethal and would be complemented by assistance from France and the European Union in particular that would include military supplies to ensure that MISCA can fulfill its peace-building mission.
Are there any inhibitions regards to training that need to be overcome vis-a-vis the Leahy Amendment? I mean, I strongly support the Leahy Amendment, but as we've recently seen, at least I've seen recently in Nigeria, there are capacities and capabilities that are not being used because the Leahy Amendment, out of an abundance of caution, people are less likely to want to train and vet individual soldiers who then could be deployed who have a human rights mindset.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not aware of any impediments to deploying the soldiers that we plan to train and see in MISCA. That said, we will, of course, comply with the Leahy vetting requirements to ensure that human rights abusers are not part of the mission. Given the makeup of Seleka and the whole history of this rebellion and the gross human rights violations that have taken place in CAR, adding people with a poor human rights record would only aggravate the situation.
Let me ask you, if I could, on Friday, November 1st, United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Mr. Adama Dieng, asserted that violence in the country may already constitute crimes against humanity and war crimes. Civilians face imminent threats of atrocities, and he would not rule out the possibility of genocide. Has this risen to the point of genocide?
Mr. Chairman, I do not believe we are in a genocidal situation. We are in a pre-genocidal situation, as the UN envoy and other experts have said, and that's why we think it's so important to move ahead with assuring that MISCA is in place next month so that we can stop the descent into worse and worse violence, and particularly into communal violence.
Is the administration making any plans for a justice mechanism, the likes of which we saw in Sierra Leone, with a tribunal or some way to significantly hold perpetrators of violence to account?
We have begun to discuss with the UN and partners the possibility of sanctions. We do not currently have enough information to imply sanctions to any individuals. We are in an information gathering mode at this time, but it's something that's under consideration.
Finally, just let me ask you, as you know, Bishop Nungo is here to provide testimony, among others, in our second panel. The church is playing, and again, having just been in Jos, Nigeria, different country, but situations that may parallel, at least, what is going on here, and that's the Boko Haram and its killing spree that they've unleashed. One of the biggest takeaways that I've had time and again, and had it most recently with Nigeria, was just how effective, how proactive, and how comprehensive the work is that the churches provide, and that they do reach out in a very significant way to the Muslims. I mean, the Grand Imam or the highest-ranking Muslim cleric in Jos couldn't have been closer to the Catholic bishop in Jos, working together to try to mitigate the violence. And Bishop Nungo will speak shortly about the efforts the church is making to try to provide safe haven, shelter, humanitarian assistance, but also to try to bridge the gap between those who commit violence and to put as much of a tourniquet on this terrible bloodletting. What's your view of the church's role, and how would you characterize the Catholic Church and the other churches' role in CAR?
The church and other religious leaders have played a fundamental role in attempting to address this cycle of violence. The Archbishop of Bangui, a prominent Protestant pastor, and one of the leading imams from Bangui have been working very actively and very effectively together to sensitize their congregants to the dangers of intercommunal violence. And I believe that the bishop will certainly amplify on that, but we view their role as pivotal and potentially of great relevance in resolving the tensions that have developed over the last year.
And are we backing that up with financial support to them, especially as it relates to the work that they do on behalf of victims? Again, another takeaway, as I met with the bishop in Jos, I was shocked and disappointed that under PEPFAR, he had received money for AIDS orphans. And as we were talking about the Boko Haram and the violence and all the things that he was doing, he said he was bewildered as to why his funding had been shut off for these AIDS orphans. When I got back to the embassy, I learned to my shock that only 9% of our money, health money and PEPFAR money, was going to faith-based organizations on a continent where faith-based is the go-to entity. And I'm wondering if we are assisting tangibly the bishop and the others, the Protestants, the other faith-based in their humanitarian endeavors.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. Of the $25 million that we provided in humanitarian assistance last fiscal year, I do not know how much went to faith-based organizations.
Could you get back specifically with that? And I would hope, I don't know if it parallels in CAR, but I would hope. I mean, I was disappointed and asked them to try to do a better job, certainly in Nigeria, because the story from the bishop in Jos was frightening. He goes, what do I do with these hundreds of children? And again, these are AIDS orphans who all of a sudden he's told, oops, your program has been terminated. Please take that back. Ms. Bass.